Okay, so welcome everyone to our very interesting webinar tonight on the 1918 flu epidemic, pandemic. Not sure what the difference is, but I'm sure I'm going to learn about this tonight. The webinar is being recorded, and everyone be sent the recording. So if you learn some interesting new information that you want to share with someone, you can do that because you'll receive the email writing inbox probably tomorrow. A little bit of housekeeping. Everyone is on silent, but we encourage you to ask questions all the way through, and at any time if a question pops into your mind, pop it in the chat box. Where a few of us have started putting where we're calling in from. So to familiarize yourself with the chat box, even though probably everyone knows now because it's been a year of Zoom, but tell us where you're calling in from. Winnipeg. That's crazy that you're calling from Winnipeg. I'm calling in from Nelson, the traditional unceded territory of the Sinixt peoples. Yeah, so let's get started. I would love to introduce Sarah, who is a researcher at the Rossland Museum, and Linda, who is an avid volunteer and expert in all things pandemic, or you know, I don't know what else she's an expert in, but I'm sure it's a lot of things. She seems like a wise woman. Yeah, so I will pass it over to both of you.
Thank you, Laura. So I have the privilege of introducing Linda, but I have a couple other things I want to say first. So first, hi, my name is Sarah Takema, and I'm the researcher at the Rossland Museum and Discovery Center in Rossland, British Columbia. I am the coordinator for our museum speaker series, which of course has been completely derailed by this pandemic. So I am so grateful to the West Kootenay EcoSociety for helping us connect to an online audience. They really have this Zoom thing figured out. So Laura, you've been wonderful to work with, and we cannot thank you enough for helping us host this presentation. Just a couple of notes from the museum before we kick off our presentation. For the Rosslanders who are tuned in, the museum is open late for late night holiday shopping on December 10, 11, 17, and 18, and will be open until 7 p.m. We're also participating in Rossland's Shop Local Holiday Bingo, which goes until December 18th with the draw on December 19. Amazing prizes. And we're a pickup point for the RCAC's Holiday Coloring Contest. So stop in and pick up some great holiday gifts and coloring pages. And also the museum will be closed December 24 to 26 and January 1st. So our speaker series presentations are usually by donation events, which helps support ongoing museum programming. Of course, this has been a pretty rough year for everyone. But if you are able, please visit the Rossland Museum website at rosslandmuseum.ca and click on the yellow donate button on the top right-hand corner to contribute a donation. And thank you so much for anybody who is able to do that. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Linda Gomez was a nurse and nurse educator for many years and always tried to incorporate history into her teaching, which she did in Vancouver and the West Kootenays. The focus of her MScN from way back in the 1980s focused on humor and health, which I think is a great combination. Plagues, pandemics, and influenza have always been a wondrous fascination to her, especially in the way communities and families handle the inherent strife. And Linda is a dedicated and much appreciated museum volunteer. And so without further ado, I'll turn things over to Linda.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. I know you have many other opportunities for what you might be doing on this Thursday night in early December. So I really appreciate you taking the time to spend it with me. For those of you who know me and have ever had dinner with me, you know that if you mention a plague or a pandemic, the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic is pan means everything. So a pandemic means that it's the entire world. So what we know is the Spanish flu pandemic covered the entire world. So it was all over the place. And so if you've been at a dinner party with me and you start to talk about a plague or a pandemic, you see that I start to twitch and I get all excited and Twitter pate, and my eyes kind of light up and I get very, very excited. And I say that it's something that I'm very interested in. My husband calls it an obsession, but somewhere in between is what really goes on. I don't know when this started, but it's been going on for a very, very long time. So we're out there, you guys, us people who are interested in the history, especially of plagues, pandemics. And it's not because we're interested in people who die, but we're interested in how people live, in the hardiness of people, in the resilience of people, in the opportunities, those people who are opportunistic in not such a great way, but in how people help one another, and in how human nature has to change. And so the 1918 flu pandemic was one of those times when probably initially it was thought that maybe 50 million people died. Now it's more likely that probably 200 million people died in this, the 1918, and I'll just refer to it as the 1918, and I'll talk more about the numbers in a little while. Over to the left of your screen, you see this window. And back in the days when we could travel, and my husband and I loved to travel, and we would walk past this window every day when we were in Andalusia. And this window was probably there for hundreds of years. And I said to him, this window has seen everything. It's got so many stories to tell. So I would call it the window to everywhere, because it just had so much to say. So tonight we're going to step through the window to everywhere, and hopefully I'll tell you some of the stories, and perhaps you'll tell me some stories as well. And I wanted to start with a little story of my grandma, so I want you to pull up a chair, and hopefully it'll be a cozier chair than the ones that are on the side of these walls. And no, your eyes are not wonky. These chairs are on the sides of some buildings in another small town that we were walking through. And there were chairs on the sides of these buildings all around this town. And I want you to pull up a very comfy and a cozy chair. And I want you to think and absorb and question whatever you would like. And as Sarah and Laura both said, stop me whenever you would like to and ask a question. But my grandma was born in 1898, and her husband was in the Navy in 1918, and he was on a ship in Prince Rupert, and he wasn't feeling well at all. He had a very high temperature, and they took him off the ship and put him in the hospital in Prince Rupert, probably around October 31st. And they looked after him in the hospital. He wasn't feeling well at all. He was having difficulty breathing. He was sweating. And as I say, they put him in the hospital, and the ship left the port and went into the Pacific. And he died on November 2nd. So Joseph Woosnam died November 2nd, and the Navy ship sailed off. So he died November 2nd, and a few days later, that ship was bombed. It was the Sophia, and all hands were lost on that ship. So I guess you could say, when your number's up, it's up. So I don't know how many men were on that ship, but a lot of men were lost. And I didn't know that story until sometime in the 80s when my mom told me. And I already had my love of learning about pandemics and plagues, etc. But it was just one of many stories I've collected over the years, and didn't really know much about my own family history, and that's just one of them. So they thought that the way that it was transmitted, the 1918, was that a bird brought it into the human population. And some of you may even know this rhyme, and it goes like this. I had a little bird, her name was Enza. I opened up the window and influenza. So you may know this. There's another one that many of us know, and it's Ring Around the Rosie, a pocket full of posies, husha, husha, we all fall down. Now that one's not from the flu, that one's actually from the plague. And that one's probably more from the plague of 1675 or 1665, 1666. There was a very bad plague in London. And then the next year they had the Great Fire of London. So it got hit really, really badly back then. But they made up these rhymes probably just to cope. And the kids used to kind of swing around and do different things. Incidentally, the word influenza comes from the word influence, influenza, influence. That's where it comes from, and it's an Italian word. So look on the left there, that's actually the virus, the influenza virus. So back in 1918, they didn't know that, and they were madly trying to identify what it was. But they thought it was a bacteria. So bacteria are much larger than viruses rather. And so there's a hierarchy, as there is with everything in the scientific world. Some of the fellows that were, because back then it was mostly men who were in the scientific world, and some of the lower scientists were saying, you know, this could be a virus. No, it's not a virus, it's a bacteria. And they didn't have electron microscopes at that time. So in fact, at Queen's University, there was a lot of research being done, and they kept going down the bacteria road. Oh, I think it's a bacteria. We're sure it's a bacteria. They spent a lot of time and a lot of money. No, it's a bacteria, it's a bacteria. And the same thing was going on in the States. No, it's a bacteria, it's a bacteria. And so they kept going down this road, both in Canada, as I say, and in the States, in Boston and in New York. And it wasn't until the 30s, when the electron microscope came out, that they identified that in fact it was a virus. And it wasn't until a fellow named, let me just get his name here, Dr. Halton, when he was doing his degree, he was doing a PhD in microbiology, he realized that there was so many people who died in this flu pandemic that he went to a little town in Alaska, in Breivik, Alaska, where 72 of the 80 people died. So 90% of the people, they were all buried in the permafrost. And when he was doing his work initially in the 50s, and he went back 3 different times over his career, and he couldn't get the proper samples that he needed, he finally went back when he was retired in the 90s, when the whole genome sequence had been figured out, and he went on his own dime, and he was working with a fellow in the States named Taubenberg, and they were able to sequence the whole gene sequence of just had a brain fart here, of the influenza virus, and they finally figured out that it was the H1N1 virus, which is up here, the H1N1 virus. And that's what was causing such havoc. And so they realized that that's what the 1918 flu virus was. And if any of you have had the flu vaccine this year, you would have had that in your flu vaccine this year. There's usually 3 or 4 viruses that are covered in your vaccine each year. And H1N1 is often covered every year in your flu vaccine. And one of the ones that was, H1N1 was also done just prior to the Olympics back in 2009. And the big problem there was, do we give it to the Olympic athletes prior? Do they get bumped up the chain because there's an Olympics, and so do we give it to them earlier? And that was a bit of an ethical dilemma. But H1N1 was the problem, and what was happening, why people were getting so sick was, and why it was hitting the younger people so much earlier and hitting them so hard, was because they were having a tremendous response to their immune response in their lungs. And so they were, was basically blowing their lungs out. And so the old people were dying, but the young people were having a huge immune response, and they were blowing their lungs out, quite frankly. So this sign to the right says the deadliest, I'm just gonna, your pictures here, the deadliest plague of the 20th century, the Spanish flu virus. And that was in newspapers all over the place. And it's a gas mask that was showing up in the newspapers there. So let's just go down to the next slide here. This is a timeline showing the first cases and where did it begin? Well, it started in Kansas. Oops, let's go back here. Kansas, and we don't see Dorothy there, but let's go here. Where are you? There. Where my little hand is, Kansas is relevant for several reasons. There. Is there a way to get, I've got all your pictures there. I'd like to get you out of there. There. Sorry, I want to get your pictures out of there. Skip share, your screen sharing. Is there a way to minimize and get the pictures out of there, Laura?
Sorry, what do you want to do? You want to minimize the presentation and you want to show something else?
No, I want to get I've got all of our pictures there, yours and mine and Sarah's and Penny's.
Oh, just like there's a little bar at the top of all of our pictures, and then drag it to the corner of the screen, like out of where you want to look.
I'll just leave it there for now. I've got, okay, can everybody see where I'm pointing to Kansas?
Yes.
Okay, so Kansas there is right smack in the middle of the United States. And in Kansas, there was a dear little soul who got the flu. She called her doctor, Dr. Miner. He came with his horse and his carriage. And she again had a very, very high fever. And he saw her, and she was a frail little lady. And he saw her, and she had her family around her. And she ultimately died, but the people around her, they also got her family. They got the flu as well. And Dr. Miner said, this is quite different. This is not like a normal flu. We have to be very wary of this. And the people in Haskell community, I'm just going to turn the page here. They, Haskell County, Kansas, they also got this as well. And for the next few days, Dr. Miner looked after these people, and they all got this flu. It was just so virulent. And the funny thing was, right next to Haskell County was Camp Funston. Now, in 1918, as you know, there was a World War going on, and Canada entered World War I right at the beginning. In 1914, Canada entered World War I, but the United States didn't enter till 1917. And so there was many, many men, mostly men, although there were some women as well. And they entered it back in, they entered it in 1917. And so there was many, many men traipsing into Camp Funston, right, which was about 2 miles away from where this first group got it. So 2 miles away. And how is it transmitted? Well, it's transmitted via droplet, and also it's airborne. So that's, they think, how it was transmitted. So there was thousands and thousands of men in Camp Funston, which was several miles away from Haskell County. And the first fellow who got it in Camp Funston was this camp cook who got a high fever again, same way. And he was in the barracks and was cooking for everyone. And he basically collapsed. And in the, they were very, very crowded conditions. And there was hundreds of men in the barracks, and it just traveled like wildfire. So all of these fellows were heading from Kansas over to the eastern seaboard, across to New York, and they were heading from New York basically to Brest, France, and then from France into Germany to fight the Germans. And at that time, the Allies weren't doing so well. We were losing the war. And many, many of the Allies got sick with influenza. And what we didn't know, though, was that this was actually a turning point in the war. And the Germans, they also became sick. And we know that about 500,000 Germans got sick at that point. We don't know how many Germans died, though, but it was a turning point in the war. And yeah,
I wanted to interrupt. There's a few questions.
Yeah.
Tiana asked, did they give the vaccine to the athletes first or not?
That is something I don't know. That is something I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. And yeah. Then another question from the city of Rossland. Were the origins of the virus in the first case, the family, ever determined? Like the Kansas family they're referring to?
Well, they think it came from a bird. That's as far as they can go. And the research that I've done is that they think that initial, the initial came from a bird. There was some question as did it actually start in New York, but every source I've come from is that it started in Haskell County and from a bird.
Another animal style. Okay, all right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that it was, so the Germans, we don't know how many died, but that was a turning point in the war. And so this was happening about September. And then, as you know, the war ended November 11th. So that was a major turning point in the war. So when you think about the numbers of people that died in the 1918, initially, as I mentioned, we thought there was about 50 million people who died. Now, the estimates are more like around 200 million people. So why the big discrepancy? Well, initially they didn't count people from India. And why is that? Well, they weren't considered human. I'll say that again. They weren't considered human, which really makes me feel quite ill. They also didn't count Aboriginal people. If you lived on an island, you weren't counted. They didn't count if you lived in the jungle, you weren't counted. There were many reasons that you weren't counted. They often didn't count many people in Africa. So if you were in any sort of a closed place, you weren't counted. So one of the books I've recommended is by Dr. John Berry. It's a real page turner. It's a real thick book. It's not something that you would take. It's not light reading by any imagination, but it's absolutely fascinating. The amount of research that Dr. Berry has done is unbelievable. He's also, there's a Smithsonian, a special that I've seen, a documentary on the Smithsonian channel rather, that is very watchable and very readable, that really summarizes the work that he's done. That's wonderful, that I would suggest. But his book it's wonderful as well. So the effect that the pandemic had on World War I was unbelievable. The other thing that, make sure I tell you, at the end of the war, that it had on the Treaty of Versailles is something else as well. So to go back to what was going on in North America, what was going on up in Canada here. In Vancouver, the first case occurred there about October 2nd. Lady named Annie Sachs. She was in her early 20s. She had a couple of kids, 2 little girls. She was hit about October 2nd, 1918. And she, within a couple of days, died on October 5th. The rest of her family got the flu, but they didn't die. They recovered, and her kids and her husband lived well into old age. So this was October 2nd, and by Christmas time, 619 people had died. So that goes to show you how lethal the H1N1 virus was. And then in Rossland, which I have the privilege to live, now it was a gold rush town, and during its heyday, there was about 7,000 people there. And by 1918, I estimate there was probably about 2,100 people living there. And there was estimates of about 50 people who died, and I've tracked about 49 of them. So if you've got any interest at all in those people, I do have their names. And the first one who died was Minnie Sanderson, and she died on October 25th, 1918. And even the chief of police died. So it was just, Rossland, as you know, is a very small town. I've got a few pictures of some of the key places in Rossland. And if you are interested, do let me know, and I can email you the list of people that I've been able to track down. But I think about 50 people did die in Rossland, either at the Mater Miz or the Hotel Allen, which was converted into a hospital back then. But it certainly hit with a vengeance in BC. This is just the barracks in BC. And my father-in-law was in World War I, and he was in Gallipoli. That's just a little fact. So why is it called the Spanish flu? It didn't start in Spain. But what happened was Spain had a revolution, and they weren't in World War I. But King Alfonso XIII got the flu, and he lived to tell the tale. And even though they weren't in World War I, information was flowing much more freely than it was in any of the countries that were in World War I. So because King Alfonso XIII got it and lived to tell the tale, it forevermore has been called the Spanish flu. So that to this day is why it's called the Spanish flu. But it did not start in Spain. It started in Haskell County, Kansas. So this is a picture of Camp Funston that started out as barracks, but in fact was turned into a hospital. And you see how close they are, very close. And one of the things that came out of this flu hospital was that before this, we didn't have curtains, and that this was the advent of hospital curtains. Prior to this, there were no hospital curtains. So there certainly were changes. Now, this is, you won't be able to read this, so I will read it to you. This was in a newspaper, and there are many newspapers with very similar ideas about how to guard against influenza. And so there's influenza, and of course now we're dealing with COVID. And COVID is quite different. They're both viruses, but they're not the same thing. Viruses, they're both viruses, and we've got COVID is like a SARS is a coronavirus, and influenza is a different kind of virus. Influenzas, there's about 4 different kinds of influenza viruses. And in terms of coronaviruses, we've got SARS and MERS, Middle Eastern viruses, but they're completely different. So even though the prevention might be the same, wash your hands, wear a mask, socially distance, but the vaccines will be different. They may be combined in the same vaccine, but they're completely different. You can't just treat them the same. So I just want to differentiate the two there. So I'll read this out as this. So this was for the 1918, and let's just see what it has to say. Influenza is spread by droplets sprayed from the nose. You'll see a lot of similarities here to COVID. Droplets sprayed from the nose and throat. Cover each cough and sneeze with handkerchief. Avoid crowds. See that? Get plenty of fresh air. Do not spit on the floor or on the sidewalk. Do not use common drinking cups and towels. Avoid excessive fatigue. If taken ill, go to bed and send for a doctor. Stay at home if you have a cold. Walk to work if possible. These rules apply also to colds, bronchitis, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. So very similar to what we're doing for COVID. So on the left, stay at home. It's a very quaint little house. And on the right, I just want to pull this up a little bit if I can. These guys are socially distancing. Now, if you look into these pots, each one of these cats is socially distancing. They're totally cool, these guys, because they are each in their own little pot, so they're socially distancing. In each pot, there's a kitten. And this is another traveling. See, when I travel, I go on these cat hunts all around the world. So they each have their own little pots, and I thought that's a great idea for socially distancing. They're just as happy as little clams there. Now, in terms of prevention, and this is just, there's a million ways that people use to prevent the flu. I just got a few here. People used garlic cloves. They'd put them in their mouth and walk around all day with garlic cloves in their mouths. Moms would cook canned tomatoes and give them to their kids. In Greece, they would mustard plasters, they'd create blisters, create a paste, and inject strychnine and re-inject them into the blister. And there was a 6% mortality rate with this. In Italy, they would inject creosote into the axilla. There was all kinds of things that they would do. Of course, they would use cinnamon and nutmeg. It just went on and on and on. So there was all kinds of ways that people would use to prevent. Is there any questions or other things that you've heard about to prevent? Here's a public notice from the city of Kelowna. Notice is hereby given that in order to prevent the spread of Spanish influenza, all schools, public and private churches, theaters, moving picture halls, pool rooms, and other places of amusement and lodge meetings are to be closed until further notice. All public gatherings consisting of 10 or more are prohibited. So that was the 19th of October in Kelowna. Masks are mandatory in some areas, and there were anti-mask movements too. And then on the right, it says wear a mask or go to jail. I don't know how strong the anti-mask movements were, but I know it existed. So we see on the left, there's a football team wearing masks. And then on the right, poor Abby the cat is feeling quite locked in there. So in terms of treatment, again, we have all kinds of different treatments, and these are just a few. So bloodletting, same thing as when you go and have your blood taken, when you have a blood sample. Bloodletting up to 500 mils per day, so that's like 2 cups. That's a lot of blood. Oxygen was given, that seems reasonable. Digitalis, so you see the purple plant there. Foxglove is the same thing. Aspirin was given for fever. Bromide to help you sleep. Opioids were used to decrease pain and calm someone. Alcohol was widely used. If anyone has any recollections of grandparents who told them, I'd love to hear them. I mean, there's so many others. People were just desperate. This is a picture of when the public health department finally did catch on. They really caught on. And down in the States, they used to have these rallies to raise money for the war bonds. And there's the public health agencies saying, you can't have these. the flu will just spread like wildfire. Please don't have them. And this went back and forth and back and forth, and they were begging them, please don't have these rallies. You can't have these parades. It's like suicide. It's like you're going to kill people. And the politicians just would not listen. They would not listen. And so when the mayor of Toronto heard about this, or when he saw this picture, he canceled a parade that was supposed to happen. And so I was really proud of the government in Canada for doing that, because they were what was happening was the rhetoric that was going on in the States was, don't be afraid, you've got nothing to be afraid of. Meanwhile, they should have been more open and saying, stay away from each other, use social distancing. They should have been using some other methods and listening to their public health department, because the health department, once they did catch on, was trying to save lives down in the States. And which is, well, you know what's going on there down right now. But in any case, the mayor of Toronto said no. He canceled all of what was going on. But places like Philadelphia, Detroit, up in Canada, Winnipeg was almost devastated. Some towns were just slaughtered. They were almost wiped out completely, because people were so used to just being so packed together, and they just weren't listening. And it's very sad to see. And in many cases, we didn't learn very much from that. And it was from the 1918 pandemic that the Canadian Health Department was formed. So we did learn some things, but not completely. We didn't learn everything, that's for sure. So this is my little town in Rossland, and you see over to the right, it says the Hotel Allen, and it was converted into a hospital, a makeshift hospital. And women were encouraged to volunteer when the Mater Ms was full. And so they were encouraged to come in and act as nurses. And from early, call it mid-October in Rossland till early January, that was when it would have been at its peak. And then women would have left their homes so they would have been in childbearing age. And they would leave their homes and might not get home for 2 or 3 days. And some of them, they were wondering who's going to feed our children. Some of them ended up dying of flu themselves. Certainly they would have been exhausted. And so it was tough times, but for the most part, people banded together. They tried to feed one another. Men who were unemployed were deputized to go and transport patients, to take supplies from one place to another. This wasn't just happening in Rossland, it was happening all over in small towns, and not only in Canada, but probably in the United States as well. People tend to band together and help each other, but I'm using Rossland as an example because that's what I know. And it's great to see that that's what does happen. There are also other examples in cities where there are long transit lines and streetcar lines, where in San Francisco, Toronto, you get on the streetcar for such a long line. And this is how virulent the H1N1 was. You get on at the beginning and it's so virulent that people would die by the end of the line. That's how sick and how people got. So those were 2 cities that are named. And it's a crazy bug, the H1N1. So this next slide is of a horse-drawn hearse. And you see this one is black. And in Rossland, there's a fellow named Al Davies, who's sort of a that everybody knows. And he wasn't alive in 1918, but his he had a shed that stored these hearses, and black was used for men who died, gray was used for women, and white was used for babies. So they had, it was color coded. So if you saw the hearse going by, then you knew if it was a man, a woman, or a baby. Now, Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the United States at the time, and as we know, the Allies did win the war, but Woodrow Wilson actually caught the flu, and it had its cognitive effects. And he caught the flu at the end of the war, and he was quite sick with it. And people said he was never the same. It had real cognitive effects. And prior to him catching the flu, he didn't believe that he knew the Germans should be punished. There should be punitive damages, of course. But after he got the flu, he negotiated in the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles. He believed and negotiated with that the Treaty of Versailles should be much more punitive than any of the other partners felt was necessary. And so there's a strong feeling that the Treaty of Versailles, that it was a real precursor to World War II. And that's not just my thinking. This is well documented. And that just blew me out of the water. And so I encourage you to go and do some more reading about this, because I couldn't believe that. But in any case, I'll leave that with you.
I have some questions for you, Linda. Or actually,
Okay.
maybe not, they're not really questions. Well, some of them are, but more just comments that I would like to read out. Gwen said that Mater-Miss was the hospital in Rossland. Is that correct?
That's right. The Mater-Miss, yeah. And it stopped operating about, I want to say about 10 years ago now. Yeah.
Okay. And then Mary Ann said, my grandmother volunteered at the hospital in Rossland during the Spanish flu.
Oh, wow.
And she spoke of it until her death at age 93 in 1990.
Wow.
Crazy.
My mother-in-law lived to be 103, and she was alive during, she would have been very, very young. She was alive during the Spanish flu, and she died of COVID this year in June.
Oh,
so I just, yeah.
Wow.
You
Crazy.
just go, wow. Yeah. Anybody else have any comments or know anyone who was alive during the Spanish flu? Or I know some.
Oh, sorry. I just want to say, if anyone wanted to unmute themselves, you're welcome to.
There's some famous people who you would all have heard of that had the flu. Walt Disney, Gandhi, Lillian Gish, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Mary Roosevelt had the flu. John Steinbeck, who wrote The Grapes of Wrath, and he said it really influenced his writing. And Groucho Marx had the flu. So many, many different people had the flu. And so I'd like to open it up to questions or general comments now.
I just wanted to continue reading what Mary Ann said. She said she spoke of, she's like her grandmother spoke of everyone coming together to help out. She also said that there were so many sick people in Rossland because young men came there to work in the mines after having fought in World War II and had damaged health. Sorry, World War I, and had damaged health. That's probably
right.
Why.
Yeah, just unbelievable. And when I was doing my research, as I mentioned, you know, the war ended on November 11th, and I was going through, because I'm doing a war vets project, and people who signed up to go to war and didn't make it, they died of the flu before they got there. And I just was just sick about that. It was such a killer, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, my grandma, I just spoke to her and it was her 88th birthday, and I asked, has there, what should I say? Have you ever seen like anything like this before? And she was like, yeah, there was a flu in 1918. I remember. I was like, wow, I know all about that now. Jill asked, do we know the mortality rate?
Well, that's what I was saying. Now they think it was around 200 million people.
Okay.
Worldwide. And I think at that time there was like 1.5 billion people in the world.
That's crazy. And Mary Ann shared that her grandma spoke of the men who died alone without their family around and how she tried to comfort them. Yeah, which sounds a lot like today's pandemic.
I know. Yeah, so many. Yeah.
Was there anything, how did the flu kind of fizzle out?
Well, it just stopped, and I suspect, and this is my sort of trying to come at it from a side, it just stopped. I think probably there was a herd immunity because so many people had it. Like pretty much everybody got it because there were 3 waves that came through Canada. So most people got it. So you would have had to have had herd immunity by that. It just stopped by about spring of 1919.
Okay. So just to confirm, people didn't inject themselves with bleach, which didn't Trump suggest that once?
Some people did use quinine.
Oh, wow.
Oh yeah, that was one of the treatments, but no, it didn't. And when those that did, it didn't work.
Was there anything?
Oh, sorry. Just as it didn't work with President Trump.
And was there a vaccine that eventually came out, or?
In 1933, when they discovered that it was a virus, because up until then they didn't know it was a virus because they hadn't discovered viruses.
Wow, that's a big gap.
Yeah.
Jill asked, what was your chance of dying? Do you know do you know how many people died?
You know, I did know your chance of dying. I don't know the exact percentage. It wasn't a huge, maybe 5%, although I might be lying and I don't like to lie. But it was the young people that it got, the young healthy people, which is not normal with an influenza. And it was a very fast moving death because their immune response was so prolific. It got their lungs and had a huge immune response.
So as someone who studied a lot of pandemics, is there any like big lessons learned from the pandemic, the 1918 pandemic, that you think that have been missed this time around?
I think, well, it's very sad to see that people still are not listening. It's very basic. Wash your hands, wear a mask, stay away from each other. It's pretty simple. It's all the same stuff. It's all the same stuff.
So yeah, we're doing everything properly. I mean, as long as we're following the rules.
Follow the rules.
Yeah.
As much as we'd all, you know, I miss hugging people too. I really miss it. I miss seeing my friends. I'd love to see my daughter at Christmas, but I won't be able to. And it's for a short period of time.
The vaccine that has been developed now and the vaccine, I know that they were 2 different kinds of flus. what was the success rate of that vaccine that came out years later, do you think? You know, if people had the vaccine now, I don't know.
Well, every year the vaccine is, there's a flu vaccine that's developed based on what's happening usually in the Far East. And they base it on statistics of what's gone on in the past year, and what our demographics, it's not just what's going on in the East, but I was looking at that today. And what's happening with our population and what's happened in the past year. So it's based on a whole bunch of different things. This year it's H1N1, H3N2, and two other aspects, two other viruses. So they try to be as accurate as possible. So it's not just back what was going on in 1918. So they try to be as accurate as possible. Much more accurate than it was in 1933.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just put a call out for any last questions. Anyone is welcome to unmute themselves and ask a question if they have any last, any last things they'd like Linda to answer. But if not, pause. All right. So I will include in the follow-up email the link to Dr. Barry's book that Linda.
Oh, did I not give sorry, there's 2 books.
No,
we are.
I'll include like a link to it. I'll include that in the follow-up information. Yeah. And Arnold, Catherine, is that the Smithsonian chapter thing that you recommended as well?
Yeah, Dr. John Barry. This is a fantastic book on the left, and the other one that's very good is Catherine Arnold's book, Pandemic: Eyewitness Accounts from the Greatest Medical Holocaust in Modern Times, Modern History. They're both excellent books. They come from a different vantage point. I would recommend them both. And the Smithsonian documentary is really based on Dr. John Barry's book.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would really recommend both of those.
All right.
And you can get them both from chapters or whatever you use however you get your books.
Great. So yeah, I'll make sure to include that with the recording and the follow-up email tomorrow. Thank you everyone for tuning in. This webinar was hosted by the West Kootenay EcoSociety. So if you don't know us already, please check us out. We're an environmental nonprofit and doing lots of work to implement renewable energy and protect old growth forests and help people have access to fresh food. So yeah, if you have any spare money this holiday season, consider donating to EcoSociety or the Rossland Museum. We both really appreciate it and would love to keep on giving you really great webinars and more information about topics that you're interested in. So thank you everyone. Linda, everyone is saying thank you and how informative you were and how great of a presentation that was. We got a wow in there as well. Killed it. So thank you very much. Sarah, did you want to say anything else?
No, just huge thank you, Laura and EcoSociety, for hosting this. It was amazing. And Linda, it was awesome.
Thank you very much for giving me the time.
Our pleasure. Okay, thanks everyone. Happy holidays. Oh, we are actually hosting one more webinar next week, which is the last one of the year. And we are hosting 4 individuals from different parts of the world who are going to be sharing their personal holiday traditions and stories from their childhood growing up and sharing how they celebrate during the holidays. So it'll be a really nice festive webinar to tune into whilst you're doing your Christmas present wrapping or you're sipping on a cup of hot chocolate. So I'll include that in the follow-up email as well for you to see if you want to register for it. Thank you very much and good night, everyone.
Thank you.